No one in the restaurant knew who the man sitting by the window really was. He was dressed simply, too simply for a place like that. No visible brand on his dark suit. No flashy watch. No need to prove anything. Outside, the city glowed with endless lights, alive with ambition and desire. Inside, crystal glasses clinked softly. Plates arrived like works of art, and conversations floated through the air, always circling the same subjects. Money, status, power. The man listened, but he did not join. He had spent most of his life surrounded by noise like this. People who spoke loudly about success. People who smiled too quickly when they sensed opportunity. Over time, he had learned that the loudest voices often hid the emptiest intentions. Tonight, he wasn't here for the food. He was here to test something far more valuable. Across the table sat 3 women. They were striking. Not just beautiful, but carefully beautiful. The kind of beauty polished over years of knowing exactly how to be seen. Perfect hair, effortless laughter, dresses that looked expensive without trying too hard. Each one carried herself with confidence, the kind that came from being admired often. They had met him only a week earlier. At least that's what they thought. To them, he was simply a wealthy man. Quiet, generous, interesting enough to hold their attention. Not overly impressive, but clearly successful. Someone worth knowing. What they didn't know was that he was far more than wealthy. He had built and sold companies before most people finished college. His name appeared nowhere in tabloids, but it appeared often in contracts that shaped entire industries. Money, to him, was no longer a goal. It was a tool. And tonight it was bait. As the waiter poured another round of wine, one of the women leaned forward slightly, smiling. "So," she said, tilting her head, "you still haven't told us what you actually do." He smiled back, calmly. "I solve problems," he replied. They laughed, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to support the channel by liking the video or subscribing. It helps us bring you more stories like this, and it keeps these narratives alive. The conversation flowed easily. Travel stories, favorite restaurants, luxury destinations mentioned casually, as if they were weekend habits rather than distant dreams. The women spoke comfortably about experiences most people only saw online. The man listened closely, not to what they said but to what they valued. When dessert arrived, he reached into his pocket and placed something gently on the table. Credit card. Black. Unmarked. Heavy. The laughter slowed. "This," he said quietly, "is for you." All 3 women looked at it, then at each other. "For us?" one asked, her voice rising just slightly. He nodded. "I want you to take this card tomorrow. Spend with it. Buy whatever you want." Their eyes widened. "No limit?" another asked. "No limit," he replied. The card seemed to glow under the soft restaurant lighting, not because it was shiny, but because of what it represented. Freedom, possibility, power. "There's just one condition," he added. They leaned in. "At the end of the day," he said, "I'll look at what you bought. That's all." They exchanged glances, smiles forming faster now. "That's it?" one of them said. "You're just curious?" He smiled again, calm, measured. "Just curious." They agreed instantly. How could they not? As the night ended and they stepped out into the cool air, excitement buzzed between them. Plans were already forming. Boutiques, jewelry stores, private showrooms. They talked over each other, listing things they had always wanted but never justified buying. The man walked behind them, listening. He already knew what would happen. But there was someone else involved in this story. Someone none of them noticed. Earlier that same day, in a quiet apartment on the other side of the city, a woman stood in a small kitchen, carefully washing a single plate. Her name was Elena. She had worked for the man for 3 years. Not as an assistant, not as a manager, as a housekeeper. Elena was efficient, quiet, and invisible to most people. She arrived early, left late, and never asked questions. She cleaned, organized, and kept the man's home in perfect order without ever disturbing his life. She knew nothing about his wealth. To her, he was simply her employer. Polite, reserved, fair. That morning, as he prepared to leave, he placed his wallet on the counter without thinking. Later, rushing out the door, he realized something. His credit card was missing. He returned to the kitchen and found Elena standing there, holding it gently in her hand. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "You left this." He paused. For a moment, something crossed his mind. An idea. "Thank you," he said, then hesitated. "Actually, I won't be back until late tomorrow." She nodded, already turning back to her work. "If you need anything," he continued, "use the card." She froze. I don't think that's appropriate," she said softly. "It's fine," he replied. "Just groceries. Anything the house needs." She nodded slowly, uncomfortable but trusting. He smiled to himself. That night, as the city slept, 3 women dreamed of indulgence, and 1 woman prayed she wouldn't make a mistake. If you're curious to see how this story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next part. What happens next reveals more about human nature than money ever could. The next day would change everything. The morning arrived quietly. Sunlight crept through the tall windows of the city, touching marble floors, glass towers, and streets already buzzing with movement. For most people, it was just another day. For the 3 women, it felt like permission. They met early, dressed impeccably, sunglasses hiding excited eyes. The black card rested safely in one of their purses, as if it carried a heartbeat of its own. "First stop," one of them said, smiling. "The boutiques on 5th." They laughed. Across the city, Elena stepped off the bus with a small reusable bag in her hand. She walked toward the grocery store near the man's apartment, rehearsing prices in her head the way she always did. She had written a short list the night before: milk, bread, fruit, cleaning supplies, and one other thing. She wasn't sure if she should buy it. At the luxury district, glass doors opened automatically as the women entered the first store. Soft music played. Sales associates appeared instantly, attentive in that effortless way reserved for people who looked like they belonged. One of the women lifted a handbag from its display. Italian leather. Limited edition. She didn't ask the price. "Wrap it," she said. The card slid across the counter without hesitation. Approved.
Mumens latte, shoes.
Jewelry. Sunglasses. Each purchase came easier than the last. The initial thrill turned into confidence. Confidence turned into entitlement. "If he's offering," one of them said, "why hold back?" They told themselves it was harmless, that this was what wealthy men expected, that generosity was a language they understood. By noon, shopping bags filled the trunk of their car. Meanwhile, Elena stood in the grocery aisle, comparing 2 brands of detergent. One was slightly cheaper, but the other was better for sensitive skin. She thought about the man's quiet habits, the way he always folded his shirts carefully, the way he never complained. She chose the better one. At the register, she hesitated before adding one final item to the conveyor belt. A small box, wrapped simply. The cashier rang everything up. When the total appeared, Elena swallowed. She reached for the card, felt heavy in her hand. Approved. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Back at the luxury district, the women had moved on to lunch. A rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. Champagne arrived without being ordered. "To generosity," one of them said, raising her glass. They toasted. Conversations shifted. From things they wanted to things they deserved. One of them checked her phone. "Still working," she said casually. "I just spent more than I make in a year." They laughed again. But beneath the laughter, something subtle changed. The spending no longer felt like fun. It felt like a test they intended to win. If you're finding yourself judging these choices, you're not alone. Stories like this reveal how money doesn't change people, it exposes them. If that idea resonates with you, supporting the channel helps us continue sharing stories that make you think long after the video ends. As the afternoon stretched on, the purchases grew more extreme. A watch, a designer jacket, A reservation placed for a weekend getaway, charged immediately. They didn't discuss it. They didn't need to. They all understood the same unspoken rule. The more impressive the receipt, the more valuable they appeared. Across town, Elena returned to the apartment. She put the groceries away neatly, wiped the counters, and placed the small box carefully on the dining table. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she wrote a short note. Nothing fancy, just a few words. She folded it once and placed it beside the box. As evening approached, the man sat alone in his office. Multiple screens glowed softly around him. Numbers moved. Messages arrived. Decisions were made. But his attention wasn't on work. It was on the data quietly populating a single screen. Transactions, timestamps, locations, amounts. He watched without expression. A handbag purchase at 10:14 a.m. Shoes at 10:22. Jewelry shortly after. He leaned back in his chair. Expected. Another transaction appeared. Lunch, champagne, premium pricing. He exhaled slowly. Then more, and more, each charge heavier than the last. He didn't feel anger. He felt distance, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the experiment began. Then, late in the afternoon, a different transaction appeared. A grocery store, a modest amount. He paused, scrolled. Household items, basic necessities. He frowned slightly. Then he saw it. One final charge. Small, unassuming. A bookstore. He clicked. Receipt details loaded. His eyes narrowed. The city outside darkened as the sun dipped below the skyline. The women prepared for the evening, admiring their purchases, taking photos, replaying the day with satisfaction. They felt victorious. They had passed the test. Or so they believed. Elena, meanwhile, finished her work and stood by the door, coat in hand. She glanced once more at the dining table before leaving. The box sat there quietly, waiting. If you want to see what the man discovers next, and why that small purchase mattered more than everything else combined, make sure you're following the channel. The next part changes the entire story. That night, as the city lights flickered on, the man finally stood from his desk. He turned off the screens, and for the first time in years he felt something tightening in his chest. Not anger, recognition. He arrived home later than usual. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that only exists in places designed to impress no one. No television, no music, just the low hum of the city far below. He removed his jacket and placed it carefully on the chair by the door, as he always did. Old habits never left him. They simply learned to coexist with success. His eyes moved immediately to the dining table. The box was still there, small, plain, almost apologetic in its presence. Next to it lay a folded note. He didn't touch either of them right away. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, staring out at the skyline. He had seen these buildings rise from empty lots. He had signed papers that made some of them possible. Yet tonight they felt distant, irrelevant. Eventually he turned back. He picked up the note first. The paper was thin, the handwriting careful, deliberate, as if every letter had been considered before it was written. Thank you for trusting me. I hope this was okay. That was all.
No explanación. No justificación.
No attempt to impress. He read it again, and again. For reasons he couldn't immediately explain, his throat tightened. He set the note down and slowly opened the box. Inside was a book. Not new, not expensive. Its cover was worn at the edges, the pages slightly yellowed. A second-hand copy, clearly chosen with intention rather than convenience. He recognized the title instantly. It was a book he had once owned. Years ago, before the money, before the deals, before his name meant anything to anyone. He sat down, carefully, as if the chair might break under the weight of memory. His fingers traced the cover. He remembered reading this book late at night in a cramped apartment, back when his biggest fear wasn't being used, but failing before he even had the chance to succeed. He flipped the first page. Inside, written in the same careful handwriting, were a few more words. I noticed it was missing from your shelf. You mentioned once it mattered to you. He closed the book. The room felt smaller. Across the city, the three women gathered for dinner, still buzzing from the day. They compared purchases again, laying items out like trophies. Each piece told a story they believed reflected their worth. One of them checked her phone. Has he said anything? She asked. Not yet, another replied, unconcerned. He probably loved it. They laughed. They spoke about what they would do next, where they might travel, what kind of lifestyle they imagined themselves stepping into. None of them questioned whether they had gone too far. People who feel entitled rarely do. Back in the apartment, the man remained seated at the table, the book still closed in front of him. He thought of the transactions. The numbers no longer mattered. What mattered was intention. He remembered a conversation from years earlier. A mentor who once told him, when you want to understand someone, don't watch how they spend money. Watch how they think when no one is watching. He exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long time, the test had surprised him. If this story is making you think about the quiet choices people make when no one is looking, consider supporting the channel. Stories like this only work because viewers who appreciate depth choose to stay with us. He stood and walked toward the bookshelf along the far wall. It was large, impressive, curated, and incomplete. There was a space where that book once belonged. A space he hadn't noticed was empty until now. He placed the book back where it belonged. Then he sat down again. His phone buzzed. A message from one of the women. Today was amazing. Thank you for trusting us. He stared at the screen. No mention of gratitude. No curiosity about him.
No reflection.
Just celebration. Another message followed. We can't wait to see you tomorrow. He set the phone face down. Silence returned. But this time it felt heavier. He thought of Elena. Her hesitation. Her refusal at first. Her choice to buy something that held meaning instead of value. He realized something uncomfortable. He had designed the test believing he already knew the outcome. That belief came from experience. From years of being admired for what he had built rather than who he was. From being surrounded by people who smiled first and listened second. But this time, the outcome didn't flatter his expectations. Challenged them. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Memories surfaced. Long nights. Empty rooms. Moments of success celebrated alone. He had always told himself that solitude was the price of achievement. But perhaps it was also the consequence of what he tolerated. The next morning would require decisions. Not dramatic ones, but honest ones. If you're still listening at this point, you're part of the small group that values stories with meaning. Make sure you're following the channel so you don't miss how this story resolves. Because the next choices will reveal who truly belonged in his life. Outside, the city continued as always. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. And for the first time in years, the man didn't feel powerful. He felt awake. The next morning arrived without ceremony.
No dramatic sunrise.
No sense of urgency, just quiet clarity. The man woke earlier than usual. He stood in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee he barely tasted, his eyes resting on the bookshelf across the room. The book Elena had returned sat there calmly, as if it had never been gone. He thought about how easily it could have remained missing, how easily he could have continued not noticing. His phone buzzed again. A message from one of the women. Can't wait to see you today. We should celebrate. He didn't reply. Instead, he scrolled through the transaction history one last time. Not to confirm what he already knew, but to understand the story behind each decision. Every purchase was a statement. Every statement revealed a belief. He shut the phone off. Later that afternoon, the women arrived together. Laughter filled the apartment before they even stepped inside. They looked radiant, confident, dressed in clothes that still smelled faintly of newness. They paused when they noticed the atmosphere. Something felt different. He greeted them politely as always, calm, reserved.
No visible tensión.
They sat. So, one of them said, smiling brightly, did we pass? The word lingered in the air. Pass. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the dining table and picked up the note Elena had written. He held it gently between his fingers. Before I answer, he said quietly, I want to ask you something. They leaned forward, curious. When you spend money that isn't yours, he continued, what do you believe you're saying? They exchanged glances. That we're comfortable with you? One replied. That we trust you, another added. He nodded slowly. And when someone gives you access to their resources, he asked, do you see it as an opportunity or a responsibility? Silence followed. It wasn't uncomfortable. Yet, one of them laughed lightly. I think you're overthinking it. He smiled. That's what I used to believe too. He walked to the bookshelf and removed the book. He placed it gently on the table in front of them. This, he said, was the most valuable thing bought with that card. They looked at it, confused. It's just a book, one said. He met her gaze. Exactly. He explained how it had once shaped him, how it had been missing, how it had been returned without being asked for, how someone who had nothing to gain had noticed something that mattered. Their expressions shifted. One of them frowned. Are you saying we did something wrong? I'm saying, he replied evenly, that you did exactly what you believed was expected of you. Another crossed her arms. You told us to spend. I did, he said. And you showed me how. The room felt colder now. If the story is making you uncomfortable, that's intentional. Growth rarely happens in comfort. Supporting the channel helps us keep telling stories that don't avoid the hard moments. He took a breath. I didn't create this test to judge you, he continued. I created it to understand myself. They waited. I wanted to know if I still surrounded myself with people who saw me, or people who saw what I could provide. No one spoke. Finally, one of them stood. So what now? She asked. He answered honestly. Now I stop pretending that access is the same as connection. They left shortly after. There were no arguments.
No slammed doors.
Just quiet disappointment, heavier than anger. When the apartment was empty again, he sat alone at the table. Later that evening, Elena arrived to clean. She noticed the book immediately. You found it, she said softly. Yes, he replied. And I realized something. She waited, unsure. I've never thanked you properly, he said. She smiled politely. You always pay on time. He shook his head. That's not what I mean. There was a pause. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time without the distance of roles. Would you sit for a moment? He asked. She hesitated, then nodded. They sat across from each other, separated not by status, but by years of silence. I'm not offering you anything, he said carefully.
No reward. No promise.
She listened. I just wanted you to know that what you did mattered. Her eyes lowered. I didn't think it would, she said. That, he replied, is exactly why it did. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't about money. It's about the quiet moments that reveal character. Make sure you're following the channel so you don't miss how this story truly ends. Outside, the city continued its endless motion. Inside, something gentler was beginning, something real, and neither of them fully understood yet what it would lead to. He didn't sleep much that night, not because of regret, but because of clarity. The kind that arrives quietly, without drama, and refuses to leave. The apartment felt different now. Not emptier, lighter, as if something unnecessary had finally been set down. He moved through the space slowly, noticing details he had ignored for years. The way the light settled on the table in the morning. The faint sound of the city breathing beyond the glass. When Elena arrived the next day, she sensed it too. There was no awkwardness.
No sudden familiarity.
Just an unspoken understanding that something had shifted. They worked in silence for a while. Then he spoke. I'd like to ask you something, he said. She looked up, attentive but cautious. Not as your employer, he added. As a person. She nodded. What do you want from life? He asked. The question surprised her. She didn't answer immediately. I want peace, she said finally. I want to wake up without fear. I want to know that the things I do matter to someone, even if no one sees them. He absorbed her words, not because they were profound, but because they were honest. He realized then how rarely he had heard honesty without ambition attached to it. If the story has stayed with you, take a moment to support the channel. Stories like this only reach the right people because viewers choose to stay, reflect, and share them forward. Weeks passed. The women never reached out again. And that was fine. Life filled the space they left with something quieter, more intentional. Elena continued working as she always had. Nothing changed outwardly.
No sudden promotions. No dramatic gestures.
But something subtle did change. He began asking her opinion. Not about cleaning schedules, but about books, about meals, about small decisions that didn't matter except that they did. He found himself looking forward to their conversations. Not because they were exciting, but because they were real. One evening, as they stood in the kitchen, he gestured toward the book on the shelf. "You returned more than a book," he said. She smiled faintly. "I just put something back where it belonged." He nodded. "So did I," he replied. Time did what it always does. It revealed. Months later, at a quiet gathering far from the city, he stood beside her, not as an employer, not as a benefactor, but as a man who had learned something too late and just in time. Someone asked him once what the test had cost. He smiled. "Less than I thought," he said, "and more than I was willing to ignore." If you believe stories should leave you changed, not just entertained, make sure you're following the channel and watching what comes next. There are more stories like this, not louder but deeper, because in the end, money didn't reveal who deserved him. It revealed who never needed it to begin with, and that was the wealth he had been missing all along.